Hi folks, welcome back to the Tabletop's Edge. Today we continue our discovery of the Second World War series with the first actual playthrough, and I've selected a discovery module from the Singapore game for today's subject. Just a quick word before we continue to maybe avoid some confusion. The Second World War series refers to scenarios as modules. I, however, am going to be using the more common terminology of scenario moving forward in this video series, just because I think for folks who are unfamiliar with the series, if they hear me saying module, they may not be clear as to what exactly I'm referring to. And I think scenario is a much more commonly used and well understood term in the hobby. So anytime you hear me saying scenario, I am technically referring to the modules in TSWW. Now, speaking of modules and scenarios, every game in the series comes with an At Starts booklet. The At Starts booklet is essentially the scenario book for the game. It will contain all of the smaller scenarios that are available to be played with that game. You will also find at least two, and depending on the game, sometimes three orders of battle booklets. Now, the information in the order of battle booklet, there'll be one for the Allies, one for the Axis, and sometimes there will be one for neutral nations. This contains all of the at-start information and the reinforcement schedules for the campaign games in each of the boxes. So, unless you're doing the full campaign game, you will not need to reference these order of battle booklets. Generally speaking, there are some larger scenarios in some of the games which will have you refer to the reinforcement and replacement schedule in the orders of battle, but for the most part, you will be using the At Starts booklet for any of the smaller scenarios you're going to be playing. And the topic of today's video is going to be the rather narrow subject of naval combat. The scenario that we are using today is Discovery number 3 from Singapore, which covers naval combat, and it actually has three parts to the scenario. We're going to cover the surface combat portion, then we're going to take a look at how naval air works, and the third part of the scenario introduces the spotting and national intelligence mechanisms. So, with the introduction out of the way, let's dive right in and see how naval combat works. Just a quick note before we continue. Throughout this video series, I will be using the latest, most up-to-date version of the TSWW rules. And in April of 2022, that means we're using version 1.6, which first appeared in Barbarossa back in 2019 and have subsequently been included in the 2021 version of Hakapela. So for those of you that own Singapore and are watching at home and you're looking at some of the charts that we will be referring to throughout this series and you're saying, well, those don't look like mine, that would explain the difference. We're using version 1.6, at least as of this video, which differs somewhat from the version 1.4 charts that came with Singapore. Now, the exception to that are any game-specific charts, things that have information relevant to the particular nations involved in that game. So stuff like the combat efficiency values, radar modifiers, naval efficiency modifiers, weather charts, stuff like that. Those I'll be using from the game in question, whether it's version 1.2, 1.4, whatever it may be. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and continue on with the scenario. I think we'll begin by giving you a little bit of background information on the scenario as well as an overview of the forces involved. Now, this particular scenario, all three parts of it, are built around the historical sinking of HMS Prince of Wales and Repulse in December of 1941, shortly after the War in the Pacific began. And the first part of the scenario actually is a hypothetical. It's going to assume that instead of being spotted by the Japanese and sunk by air attack, that the Royal Navy force that sailed out of Singapore evaded Japanese detection and has now come across the covering force for the invasion fleet. What this will do is it'll allow us to look at the surface naval combat system in some detail and isolation. So, with that in mind, we'll take a look at the forces here real quickly. As you can see on screen, down at the bottom here in the navy blue, we have the Royal Navy force. We have the battleship Prince of Wales, which is a very good surface ship with a gunnery factor of 46 and a protection of 8. We then have the battlecruiser HMS Repulse, not quite as good with only a 26 gunnery factor and 6 protection. Then we have 2 E-class destroyers, Electra and Express, and then finally a destroyer escort flotilla composed of World War I vintage S-class destroyers. Now, facing this small Royal Navy fleet, the Imperial Japanese Navy has 2 battleships, the Haruna and Kongo. These battleships are not quite as good as Prince of Wales, with only a 38 gunnery factor and a 6 protection factor, but they are, in fact, better than Repulse. They are accompanied by 3 heavy cruisers, Atago, Chokai, and Takao, and then 9 destroyers. So this is not a very balanced scenario or a very balanced engagement, but that's not the goal of this particular scenario. We're not looking for a balanced game here. The object is to learn how the surface naval combat system works. So with the forces introduced and out of the way, let's go ahead and proceed with naval combat. Since this first portion of the scenario deals very strictly with surface naval combat resolution, we don't need nor will we be using any of the maps in the game. Instead, the entirety of this portion of the scenario will take place on the naval combat range display, which we will see momentarily. Now, whenever a transit combat is declared, and a transit combat is the term that TSWW uses for any naval battles that occur during a naval movement segment, one side or the other has the potential to avoid the combat entirely by making a successful evasion check. Now, if both sides decide they want to evade the battle, which is probably going to be a rather rare occurrence, but it may happen. If both sides wish to evade, it is an automatically successful evasion. There is no combat, and the moving task group would simply continue on its way. Now, if one side wants to fight and the other side wants to evade, that will require an evasion check. In this particular circumstance, even without knowing how the naval combat system works, I think it's pretty clear to anyone looking at this situation that this is going to be a very one-sided fight. And so the Royal Navy is going to attempt to evade this particular combat. The evasion check is made by rolling 1d10 on the Naval Success and Spotting table we find here on page 19 of the version 1.6 charts. As you can see, there are 3 possible results to this table, and this is a table that you are going to see a lot of when you play this series, because it is used for a large number of it is used to resolve a large number of different naval related tasks. So we have an F or fail result, we have an F asterisk, what I refer to as a partial failure, and an S or succeed result. In order to successfully evade a battle, you will need to roll an 8 or higher, getting an S result. Now that die roll is going to be modified by 3 things. It's going to be modified by the weather, by the naval efficiency modifiers of both sides, and by the tactical combat speed differential between the 2 task groups in question. Now, the weather in this scenario is good with calm seas. So if we look down lower on the chart here, we'll see the sea effects chart. And for calm seas, we see no modifier. Next, we're going to have to take a look at the naval efficiency modifiers. That we will be looking at in the game-specific chart. So this is the version 1.4 charts that come in Singapore. And you can see here, this chart lists all of the nationalities involved in the game, as well as year by year. So for Britain, in 1941, they have a naval efficiency modifier of +1. Japan, in 1941, has a naval efficiency modifier of +2. Since the British are trying to evade, we will subtract the Japanese 2 from the British 1, giving us a -1 modifier. Finally, we need to look at the slowest ship in the British task group. In that case, it's either the Prince of Wales or the S-class destroyer escort flotilla with a 7. And from that, we're going to subtract the slowest Japanese ship. And here we see the slowest ships are the two battleships with a speed of 8. Subtracting 8 from 7 gives us another -1 for a total modifier to the evasion die roll of -2. Now you can see, since we need an 8 or more, the only thing that's going to allow the British to evade this battle is if we roll a 10 on the die. And in this case, we rolled a 4. 4 minus 2 gives us a 2, and you can see here on the top row, less than 5, that is a failure result. The British have failed to avoid the combat, and therefore we will have at least one round of naval combat, which means it's time to go to the naval combat range display. Here we have the naval combat range display taking up most of this page of charts. We will actually be referring to these charts down here in the course of this playthrough, but we'll talk about those in just a moment. The naval combat range display, as you can see, has 5 range bands. We have a long range, a short range, a torpedo range, another short range, and then another long range. Basically, this is going to be used to represent the relative ranges of the ships for both sides. So we'll have one side, the Japanese, will place in the top here, and we'll place the Royal Navy ships along the bottom. Most naval combats begin with all of the ships at long range. There are a couple of exceptions, such as when an escorted convoy is attacked, but I'll go over those exceptions when and if we happen to come across them throughout the series here. But for now, since this is just a normal surface fight, it's going to start with the ships at long range. Now, when you are placing your ships onto the naval combat range display, first thing you're going to have to do is divide your task group up into divisions. Now, these divisions are essentially the maneuver elements, if you will, in a naval battle. By that I mean all of the ships that are placed in a single division will change range together. They will attempt to disengage together. And a division can be as small as a single ship, or it can be as large as the entire naval task group. There are just a couple of restrictions when forming divisions. First, all aircraft carriers must be placed in the same division, and that division then must attempt to immediately disengage from the surface combat. Second, all naval shipping points, NSPs, and fleet oilers need to be placed in the same division, and they too must immediately attempt to disengage. That's about it as far as forming divisions. And we'll start with the Royal Navy, since it's the smaller force, and I think when you see this, as we walk through this, it will make more sense to you. The British have a couple of capital ships and 3 escort units. So what we'll do is we will place the Prince of Wales and the Repulse, both of our capital ships. We're going to place those in one division, and then we're going to place our 3 escorts in a second division. And the reason we're going to do that is it's possible for a division that is attempting to disengage. You can have another division in your naval task group screen or attempt to screen the disengaging division from the enemy, giving them a better chance to actually disengage by having them close the range. So theoretically, we could have even though we could not avoid the battle entirely, we could choose to have the 2 capital ships disengage from this fight, and we could, instead of having the escorts also attempt to disengage, instead we could have the escorts go in and try to distract the Japanese, perhaps with a torpedo attack, as the larger capital ships are getting away. Now on the Japanese side, I think we'll keep it fairly simple and do something very similar to how the Royal Navy form their divisions. We'll have the 2 battleships form a division, and then we're going to place the 3 heavy cruisers in a second division. And then finally, we will have, I think we'll just place all 9 destroyers in a 3rd division. And we'll see as the battle progresses perhaps, if it lasts that long, why we decided to break out the cruisers into a division to themselves. Now, one thing that I wanted to go over when we were reviewing the forces, but forgot, so I'll do it now, are the codes that are on some of these units. You can see here on the, maybe not. Let's go ahead and do it this way. Let's see if I can zoom in here a little bit better. On the Royal Navy, the destroyers have no code, so we don't have to worry about that. But we do have an R on both Prince of Wales and Repulse. That R indicates that these ships have radar, which means they will get a they will use the radar modifier for Britain in 1941. Which, if we consult the radar modifier chart, you can see Britain 1941 is a +1. So both of these ships, or each of those ships, will get a +1 to their gunnery die roll in the course of the combat. On the Japanese side, we have the two battleships, each of which have an F code. F indicates that they have a float plane. So for the purposes of this combat, they will get a +1 from the float plane, which will be acting as a spotter on all of their gunnery die rolls. Now we have the heavy cruisers. The heavy cruisers have code LF. Well, we know what the F is all about. That's the float plane. The L indicates that they are armed with long lance torpedoes. Now, the long lance is a Japanese-specific torpedo, and it represents in the game here the larger, much longer ranged long lance torpedo that the Imperial Japanese Navy used. Normally, if a ship is going to fire its torpedoes, it must be in the torpedo range band here. However, if it is armed with long lance torpedoes, it may fire its torpedoes from the short range band. And the torpedoes, as we will probably see as we play through the combat, will have a better chance of doing more damage. So it's actually quite a rather important or nice advantage for Japanese naval units in surface combats. And then all of the destroyers here, all 9 of them, have the L code as well, indicating that they do indeed have long lance torpedoes. And we have one destroyer here, the Sagiri, which has code LM. The M indicates it is a mine layer, which will not come into play in the course of this particular scenario. So now that we have the ships on the display, set up and divided up into their divisions, we're ready to actually begin the first round of combat. Surface naval combat in the Second World War is resolved in a series of rounds, and these rounds will continue one after the other until one side no longer has any ships remaining in the combat, either because they've all successfully disengaged or because they've all been sunk. Now, each round is comprised of 4 steps. First is the disengagement step, where you will attempt to disengage units by division from the battle. Next, you resolve gunnery fire. Third, you resolve torpedo fire. And then finally, you may attempt to change the range, again, by division, either increasing or decreasing the range to the enemy's ships. Now, the disengagement step occurs at the beginning of every naval combat round except for the first one. So if a force is seeking to avoid combat, if they fail their evasion check, as the Royal Navy did in this particular scenario, they will be subject to at least 1 round of naval combat. Now, we're going to skip that step here in round 1, which is going to take us directly to the gunnery fire resolution step. And this is where the naval combat system in TSWW gets a little involved, in my opinion. Now, let me show you what I mean. Naval gunnery fire is resolved in TSWW by allocating your gunnery factors against individual enemy ships and then rolling target by target to determine how many hits each ship suffers. Pretty simple, right? Well, this is where the detail in the series comes into play. Each of the rolls on the Naval Gunnery CRT is subject to a number of potential die roll modifiers. So let's look at those. We can find them listed here below the Naval Combat Range display. The first one is weather. In this particular scenario, it's good weather, calm sea state, so that will result in a no modifier to the roll. Second is your naval efficiency modifier. That's going to be a +1 for the Royal Navy, and it's going to be a +2 for the Japanese. Third, any ships that are equipped with radar will have a +1 modifier to all of the die rolls they make on the naval gunnery table. Now below that, the next line, we see interference and splitting fire. And these are the two rules or die roll modifiers that prevent you from just totaling up your factors and splitting them however you like and simply rolling the die. Splitting fire is the one we'll talk about first. Any of your ships can split their naval gunnery factors among one or more enemy ships. So the Prince of Wales with 46 gunnery factors could theoretically fire one gunnery factor at 46 different targets. But you're never going to do that because the results would be a miss. For every ship that a single ship targets in a single round, you will have a -1 DRM to your die roll. So for instance, if the Prince of Wales decides to split his 46 gunnery factors against these 3 Japanese heavy cruisers, say 16 against Atago, 15 against Chokai, and the final 15 against Takao, he would suffer a -3 for the 3 targets on each roll against each of those ships. Now, the interference die roll modifier is meant to model or take into account the difficulty in correcting your fire when you have shell splashes from multiple ships falling around the same target. So the interference modifier is going to give you a -1 for every ship beyond the first one that is firing at the same target. So for example, if Prince of Wales and Repulse decided to combine their fire and concentrate it against Atago, there would be a -1 for 2 ships firing at them. If Electra joined in and we had 3 ships firing at Atago, it would be a -2 die roll modifier. Now it's important to remember that interference and splitting fire are cumulative. Along with your naval efficiency modifier and radar, all the gunnery DRMs are cumulative. So if we had a situation where the Prince of Wales is splitting its fire among the 3 heavy cruisers, and Repulse decides to split its fire among these 2 heavy cruisers, every die roll made against Atago and Chokai would have a -4 modifier. It would be -3 because the Prince of Wales is splitting against 3 ships, and then it would be an additional -1 because we have 2 ships firing at Atago and Chokai, and the die roll modifier against Takao would be a -3, and that would be in addition to the radar and naval efficiency modifiers. So if we were to take all of the naval gunnery fire modifiers into account, we would have a -4 for interference and splitting, +1 for radar, +1 for NEM, which would give us a net -2 for shots taking at these 2 cruisers and a -1 here for the 3rd cruiser. All of this means that when you are allocating your naval gunnery factors, you are going to have to keep track of not only how many ships or which ships each of your ships are firing at, but you're also going to have to keep track of how many ships are shooting at each of the individual targets. And even in a relatively small surface fight like we see here, I've found that I can't do this without having some sort of scratch paper and pen or pencil handy to keep track of who is firing at whom, because you very quickly get into a situation where you're going to have to remember. You can see there are 9 destroyers here. There are fewer than 9 Royal Navy targets, so some of these vessels are going to be having to combine their fire against some of the Royal Navy ships, and trying to keep all of that straight in your head is, well, it's beyond me personally. So I find that allocating and noting down exactly which ships are firing at which targets is absolutely vital. So I think as we take a look at this first round of combat, you'll kind of get an idea of exactly what I mean and what is involved in this process. So let's go ahead and proceed, and we'll start with the Royal Navy firing. It's important to remember that naval gunnery fire is simultaneous. So none of the damage that is inflicted by one side will take effect until both sides have resolved their fire. The gunfire effects do take effect, however, before the torpedo combat step. So any ships wishing to fire torpedoes are going to have to survive the gunnery fire step, and then any damage they incur may reduce the number of torpedo factors they have to launch at the enemy. Now, we are starting this particular round of combat with all of the ships in the long-range bands, and there is a note over here next to the long-range bands at the edge of the naval combat range display, and it says firing from here, use heavy guns versus enemy at long range, all guns at other ranges. Since everybody's at long range, only heavy guns will be able to fire at opponents in this round until or unless some ships move into the short or torpedo range. Now, how do we know how many heavy guns a particular ship has? We're going to have to consult the naval gunnery split chart, which is conveniently found down here in the lower left. You can see it lists the ship type down the left side, and then there are two columns, one for heavy anti-aircraft guns and one for heavy guns, surface guns. The first line is for capital ships, which are essentially battleships and battlecruisers, carriers and cruisers. If we look across to the heavy guns column, we'll see that 70% of the gunnery factor of these types of vessels are comprised of heavy guns. In order to find the precise number of factors that the Prince of Wales has in heavy guns, we simply multiply 46 times 0.7. That's going to give us a total of 32 factors. The remaining 14 factors are normal guns, which would be the secondary and tertiary batteries on large ships like this. Now you'll see the next line down says escorts and minor ships. Escorts are going to be your destroyers, destroyer escorts, essentially anything smaller than a cruiser. And notably, you will see that escorts and minor ships have no heavy guns. What this means for us right now is that none of the 3 Royal Navy destroyers will be able to fire upon any of the Japanese destroyers in this round. Likewise, none of the Japanese destroyers will be able to fire. It will be only their 2 battleships and 3 heavy cruisers. So we've got the 2 capital ships for the Royal Navy firing and have 5 Japanese ships returning fire. Now we have 32 factors. We won't be able to use all 46 of Prince of Wales. And for the Repulse, 70% of 26 is going to give us 18 heavy gun factors, and the remaining 8 are normal factors. We could choose to combine the 2 and fire a total of 50 factors at one of the Japanese ships, but we would incur, again, that -1 for interference with 2 ships firing. Since the Japanese have 2 battleships, let's go ahead and we'll just have the Prince of Wales and Repulse engage one of the battleships each. So Prince of Wales will fire at Haruna and Repulse will fire at Congo. Now on the Japanese side, the Japanese have 5 ships that are capable of firing at, well, up to 5 targets. There is one more gunnery factor related consideration you want to keep in mind, and that is some gunnery factors are going to be halved when fired against certain targets, and some factors will be doubled when fired against other targets. If we look at the gunnery target modifiers here, you can see that the gunnery factors are halved whenever a battleship carrier, battlecruiser, or monitor fires at a destroyer, destroyer escort, torpedo boat, gunboat, or fast attack ship. Basically, when the really big guns are firing at small ships, they are not as effective and they would be halved. So the 32 factors that Prince of Wales has, if she decided to put all 32 of them against the Japanese destroyer Arashio, it would actually be halved, and we would only have 16 that we would use to fire at her on the naval gunnery table. So with that in mind, the Japanese are going to have their battleships engage the British capital ships. The heavy cruisers could fire at the destroyers, and because they are not a battleship or monitor or battlecruiser, they don't have to worry about having their factors halved. And to keep this fairly simple and straightforward, we could just have each of the Japanese ships engage one of the Royal Navy ships. But we're not going to do that. Instead, I think the Japanese are going to concentrate, while they have the advantage, on the two larger British ships, even though that's going to entail some potential negative die roll modifiers. Now, Haruna and Kongo each have 38 gunnery factors. When we multiply by 0.7 to determine how much heavy gunnery factors they have, it works out to be 26 factors for each of them. So Haruna will fire 26 at Prince of Wales, Kongo 26 at Repulse. Now, the cruisers all have 17 total gunnery factors. 0.7 of that results in 11 heavy gun factors. So they will have a total of 33 additional factors that they can add to the battle. What we'll do, since Prince of Wales is the bigger enemy ship and more powerful ship, we will have Atago and Chokai join Haruna and fire everything at Prince of Wales, while Kongo and Takao will fire at Repulse. So if you're keeping track at home, we have 26 factors from Haruna, plus 11 and another 11, for a total of 22, and 26 is 48 factors being fired at Prince of Wales, and we will have 26 plus 11 for 37 factors fired at Repulse. Now, it's going to be important to keep track of all of these because it's going to take us a while to make the die rolls to resolve these attacks. So let's go ahead and take a look at the naval gunnery chart, since we're now kind of ready to move on and make the rolls. Actually, you know what? Before we do that, let's figure some of the gunnery die roll modifiers. First of all, the Prince of Wales firing at the Haruna, the weather is 0. They get a +1 for their naval efficiency modifier. They get a +1 for radar. They're not splitting fire, and there's no interference. So basically, they're going to get a +2 when they shoot at Haruna, and Repulse is going to have the same +2 when they fire at Kongo. Coming back the other way, when the Japanese are resolving their fire against the Prince of Wales, they have 1, 2, 3 ships that are firing at Prince of Wales. That's going to be a -2 for the interference modifier because we have 3 ships firing. None of those ships are splitting their fire, fortunately, so we don't have to worry about the splitting fire modifier. Weather is 0. Their NEM is +2, so that's going to offset that -2, and none of the ships are equipped with radar. However, all of the ships are equipped with float planes, which is going to give them that +1. So the net DRM for the Japanese fire at Prince of Wales is +1. For the fire at the Repulse, we only have 2 ships firing, so the interference DRM is only going to be a -1. That's going to be offset by the float plane, and then they have an NEM of +2, so it's going to be a net +2 against the Repulse. So the Royal Navy is firing with a +2 and a +2, and the Japanese will have a +1 and +2. Let's see what the naval gunnery chart looks like and how we actually end up resolving this. We see here the naval gunnery CRT, and across the top we have columns representing the number of gunnery factors that are being fired at the ship, and then down the left side here we have our dice roll. So we will roll our die, add the DRM, and cross-reference it with the appropriate column to determine whether we get a miss, which is an M result. We have an M asterisk result, which is a hit against landing barges, landing craft, or protection rating 1 only ships. We have an H asterisk, which again is going to be a hit against small ships or naval shipping points, or ships with a protection rating of 1 or 2. And then finally we have an H indicating 1 hit and a 2H indicating 2 hits. And if you look down here at the 10 on the 11 column, the 2H asterisk indicates a potential critical hit. So let's take the resolution against Haruna first. We have the Prince of Wales firing at her with 32 gunnery factors. The chart, as you can see, goes from the 1 to 2 column all the way up to 11 plus. Now, because we're on the 11 plus and we have more than 11 factors, we're actually going to get multiple die rolls on this chart. What you will do is subtract the protection factor of the target ship from the incoming gunnery factors to determine which column you are on. So in order to roll on the 11 plus column, the Haruna has a protection factor of 6, it would require 17 gunnery points for the British to make a roll on this column. We have 32 that are incoming. So 17 is going to give us one roll on the 11, and we have 15 gunnery factors left over. The protection factor of a ship is used against every shot taken against her. So we now subtract the protection factor of 6 again from the 15, which results in 9. So the Prince of Wales will roll once on the 11 plus column and once on the 9 column. And each of those rolls will get a +2 net DRM. Now I will go ahead and roll those dice here. The red die will be the 11 plus column and the yellow die will be the 9 column. And we have a 5 plus 2 is a 7 on the 11 column. And we cross index, we see an H, that's 1 hit there. And we have a 10 plus 2 is 12 on the 9. That's going to give us a 2H, which is 2 hits. So that's a total of 3 hits that are scored on the Haruna. Now, if we had rolled this 10 instead on the 11 plus, we would have had 2H asterisk. It would have resulted in 2 hits, and we would have had to roll again on the critical hit table down here, where you can see the results range anywhere from no effect to 1 extra hit, 2 extra hits, or the ship is just outright sunk. There are 2 modifiers to the critical hit table. Probably the more common one, certainly in a game like Singapore, is going to be a +2 if an Imperial Japanese Navy destroyer is hit by a torpedo. So the Prince of Wales has managed to do 3 hits to Haruna, but how do we know how many hits Haruna can take before she's sunk? That is based on each ship's protection rating. Haruna, having a protection rating of 6, we can consult the ship protection chart here, and we come down to the protection rating of 6, and we see the number of hit points that she has is 4. So the British have come up 1 hit point short of sinking Haruna in this first round. Now let's resolve the fire against Congo. Against Congo, Repulse had 18 gunnery factors. Congo also has a protection rating of 6, so 18 minus 6 is 12. That's going to be enough to get us 1 roll on the 11 column, and then we have 1 gunnery factor left over. -6 is a -5, which means we're going to be resolving it here on the 1 to 2 chart. And again, we'll have the red die be the 11 column, and the yellow die will be the 1 column. Each of these, again, subject to a +2 modifier. And you see we rolled a 7 on the 11 column and a 2 on the 1. Now 7 plus 2 is a 9. That's going to give us 2 hits. And a 2 plus 2 is a 4 on the 1 to 2 is a miss. So we managed to inflict 2 hits on Congo, which, because it has a protection rating of 6, also has 4 hit points. Now for the gunfire coming back from the Japanese at the Royal Navy. First, we'll look at Prince of Wales. Prince of Wales has 48 gunnery factors targeting her. Her protection rating is an 8, however, which means it's going to take 19 points to get a roll on this 11 plus column. So the Japanese will get 2 rolls on the 11 column. That's going to be 38, and they will have 10 points remaining, from which we subtract the protection factor once again, leaving 2, which is going to give them 1 roll on the 2 column. So we'll roll the 2 rolls on the 11 first, and again, each of these rolls is going to get a modifier of +1. We have a 5 and a 1. So a 5 plus 1 becomes a 6, that's a single hit, and a 1 plus 1 is a 2, that gives us a second hit. And now for the roll on the 1 to 2 column, it is a 3, becomes a 4, that is a miss. So the Prince of Wales has suffered 2 hits herself. And then finally, we're going to resolve the attack against Repulse. We had 37 gunnery factors fired at Repulse, and I believe her protection rating is a 6, like the Japanese battleships. So 17 gunnery factors will give us a roll on the 11 table, and that is going to leave 20 left over. So that's going to give us another attack here, and then the final 3 factors, -6 is going to be a -3, so it'll be a 3rd roll on the 1 to 2 column. Now these attacks will get a modifier of +2. So we'll roll the 2 attacks on the 11 first, and you see we get an 8 and a 3. The 8 plus 2 gives us a 10. That's going to be 2 hits and a potential critical hit. And then a 3 plus 2 becomes a 5. That's a third hit. Now, on the critical hit table, we'll make one roll here, and there are no modifiers. The 5, and you see 3 to 5, that's going to be 1 extra hit. So we're able to score 2 hits, 3 hits, and the critical hit gave us 1 additional hit. Finally, we have a roll on the 1 to 2 column, and it is a 6, which becomes an 8. That is going to be a miss asterisk, and that will result in a miss in this case. So Repulse suffered a grand total of 4 hits. Now, you can see with her protection rating of 6, she only has 4 hit points, which means Repulse was in fact sunk in this first round of gunfire. I'm going to go ahead and record the results of the resolution. We have hit markers here that are included in the game. Normally you'd place these on top of the damaged ships, but rather than obscure the ships themselves, I'll just place the hit markers adjacent to them, or above or below them, so that we can still reference the ships. And poor HMS Repulse has been sunk, so she is removed from the battle. That is the gunnery step of the first round. We now move on to the torpedo combat, and there are no eligible units to launch torpedoes, so we'll go straight to the range change step. Now, the Japanese wish all of their destroyers and their cruisers to close the range so that they can launch torpedoes as well as actually get involved in the fight itself. Royal Navy is thinking that in round 2 they may try to have Prince of Wales disengage before she too gets destroyed. That is going to take a roll of a success on the Naval Success and Spotting table, which, as you recall, is here, and it would require normally an 8 or more to get the success in order to disengage. However, if the F asterisk, or the partial fail result, is achieved, the ship or division technically will disengage from the battle. However, they will be subject to one last round of gunnery fire in this second round. So you can improve the chances of any particular division disengaging by having another torpedo-armed division close the range to sort of distract the enemy and launch some torpedoes and maybe discourage any attempt to pursue. So with that in mind, the Royal Navy is going to have the destroyer division here attempt to close the range. Now, how do you resolve closing the range? It's not necessarily automatic. What you're going to do is, if in fact all of the ships on both sides want to either close the range or everyone wants to open the range or increase the range, then it's automatically successful. That's not occurring in this particular situation, so we have to break it down by division. You will pair up one division from each force that wants to do the same thing. So in this case, we have the destroyers on each side are wishing to decrease the range or close the range. In that case, those divisions each automatically succeed in closing the range. So all of the Japanese destroyers will close here to short range, as will the 3 Royal Navy destroyers. Now, we still have this division here of the heavy cruisers that wish to close the range, but there's no one really to match up with. The Prince of Wales is trying to not close the range. Therefore, the cruisers are going to have to make a successful roll on the Naval Success and Spotting table. The modifier for this will be the differential in naval efficiency modifiers. Actually, I take that back. It's going to be your naval efficiency modifier. Actually, it is the differential of the naval efficiency modifiers and then the differential in tactical speed, taking damage into account. Now you can see the Japanese cruisers here have a speed of 9. Prince of Wales' printed tactical speed is 7. However, she has suffered 2 hits. For every hit that a ship suffers, you reduce its torpedo factors, its speed, and one other thing by 1. Anti-aircraft So anti-aircraft, torpedo factors, and speed, basically the bottom three numbers here, are all reduced by 1 for every hit. So Prince of Wales now is down to a speed of 5. That's going to give the Japanese a +4 on their chances to close the range, in addition to their +2 naval efficiency modifier minus the +1 from the British. So that's going to give them a +1 differential. So you have +4 for the speed, another +1 for the naval efficiency modifier, and that's going to give us a +5, I think. You know what? I'm going to double check that after I roll this to make sure it's a differential and not just purely your naval efficiency modifier. So it's either going to be a +5 or a +6. Let's roll the die and see what happens here. All right. Roll of a 3 plus 5 gives us an 8. If it had been +6, it would be a 9. So in either case, we are going to get the success result, thus allowing the heavy cruiser division to also close the range. Now, that brings us to the end of the first round of naval combat. We'll move now on to the second round. And I'm also going to go ahead and look up that modifier for changing range. Here is how the board looks at the start of the second round of naval combat. You can see the 3 remaining capital ships are at long range, while all of the other ships on both sides have managed to close the distance to short range. We will begin the second round with the disengagement step. The Royal Navy would like to try to save Prince of Wales by disengaging her from the combat before she suffers additional hits and is sunk. Now, to do so, we're going to have to roll a success on the Naval Success and Spotting table. That's this table here, the one I told you we would be seeing a lot of in this game series. That die roll, it's going to be 1d10, and it's going to be modified by the weather, by the tactical combat differential, the tactical combat speed differential, the NEM differential, and if the disengaging side has a division of torpedo-armed ships that they would like to commit to making a torpedo attack in order to assist the disengaging division or divisions from escaping, that would be modified by +3 in that case. So the Royal Navy has decided to sacrifice the destroyers here in an attempt to give Prince of Wales an additional +3 to her attempt to escape the battle. Now we will make that roll now before we move on to the gunnery and torpedo combat resolutions. So the modifiers for this die roll are going to be 0 for the weather. The speed differential, we're going to take the differential of the slowest ship in the division. In this case, it's 7 minus 2 for the 2 hits, gives us a 5. And from that, we're going to subtract the slowest speed in the whole enemy naval task group, not just any one particular division. And we can see that Haruna here has a tactical speed of 8, but with 3 hits that have been suffered, her speed is down to 5, which actually matches Prince of Wales. So that's going to be another +0 for the speed differential. Now when it comes to NEM, the Japanese have a 2, subtracted from the 1 of the British gives a -1. And then finally, because we are going to commit this division of destroyers to making a torpedo attack, that will give us a +3 in this round of attempted disengagement. So that's going to ultimately give us a +2 to the die to see if we can roll a net 8 or better. So we'll need a 6 or better on the die here in order to save Prince of Wales. And we just miss. 5 plus 2 is 7. However, while 7 is not an S result, it is a partial fail. It's an F asterisk, which means that Prince of Wales will in fact be able to disengage. However, she will be subject to one last round of gunnery fire in this second round of combat. If she survives that, she will then be removed from the combat and be able to continue on her way. So, with that out of the way, we now move on to gunnery resolution. And when it comes to resolving gunnery fire, we're going to start with the Prince of Wales. Because the Prince of Wales rolled a partial failure or partial success, if you want to think of it that way, in terms of disengaging. She is disengaging from the battle. However, because it was an F asterisk result, the enemy does get one last round of gunfire against her, but only with heavy guns, which means that all of the destroyers here, even though they're at short range and would normally be able to fire at ships at any range, because they lack heavy guns, they will not be able to participate in attacking Prince of Wales this round before she escapes. Now, the Japanese desperately want to sink the battleship, so they're going to concentrate both of their battleships and all three of their heavy cruisers on the escaping battleship. Now we need to calculate how many factors are being fired at Prince of Wales. Now, for the heavy cruisers, it's the same as last round. They have taken no damage, so they have 11 heavy gun factors each for a total of 33. The battleships, however, have taken damage. And just as hits reduce your anti-aircraft, torpedo, and movement factors, they also impact your gunnery factors. They will remove proportionately a percentage of your total gunnery factors compared to the amount of total hit points you have. I know that is a confusing way of saying it, so let's just use a real-world example. Congo has 4 hit points. Actually, they both have 4 hit points. Congo has suffered 2 of her 4 hit points in damage. That's 50% damage to the ship. Therefore, she is going to lose 50% of her total gunnery factors. 38 becomes 19 total gunnery factors. However, we do have to multiply those 19 factors by 0.7 in order to determine the number of heavy gun factors that remain, and that's going to give us a total of 13, with the other 6 being normal gun factors. Now for Haruna, she has suffered 3 hits or 75% damage, which means she only has 25% of her total gunnery factors remaining. When we multiply 38 times 0.25, we get 9.5, so that's going to be 9 total factors remaining. And of those 9 factors, we have to multiply that by 0.7 to get a total of 6 heavy and 3 normal gun factors. So when we add these all together, we have 6 gunnery factors from Haruna, we have 13 from Congo for a total of 19, and then 33 from the heavy cruisers is going to give us a grand total of 52 gunnery factors being fired at Prince of Wales. When we go over to the naval gunnery chart now, you can see 52. It's going to take 19 factors to get a roll on the 11 plus column. So with 52 factors, that's going to give us 2 rolls on the 11, and that will consume 38 of the 52 factors, leaving 14 remaining. From that, we subtract the 8 protection factor again, leaving a roll on the 6 column. So 2 rolls on the 11 plus and 1 roll on the 5 to 6 column. The modifiers for these rolls, however, are as follows. Because we have 0 for weather, we're going to get +2 for the Japanese NEM, 0 for radar, +3 for the float plane. We have no splitting of fire, but now we have to look at interference, and we have a total of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 ships all firing at Prince of Wales. That's going to be -4 for interference. So let's see what I say. That's +2, +3 for the float planes, -4, so that's going to be a grand total net DRM of -1 on each of these 3 shots. So let's go ahead and roll on the 11 column. We have those 2 rolls first, and we roll a very good 10 and a 7. That becomes a 9 and 6. So a 9 is going to give us 2 hits. A 6 is going to give us 1 hit for a total of 3 hits. And then 1 more roll on the 5 to 6, and ooh, it's a good one too. That's an 8, which becomes a 7, and that is going to give us a 4th hit. So 4 more hits on Prince of Wales, which you can see her protection rating is an 8. She has a total of 6 hit points, and added to the 2 hits she suffered in the first round of combat. That's going to bring her for a total of 6, and it will in fact sink the Prince of Wales. So she just barely failed to escape the battle. Now we'll continue with the rest of the surface gunnery combat between the destroyers. To finish up the gunnery fire for round 2, we have the Royal Navy destroyers and the Japanese destroyers left to shoot. Now the Japanese destroyers will be concentrating on the 3 Royal Navy destroyers. The Royal Navy destroyers, being at short range now, are able to engage and shoot at any of the Japanese ships. And while we would very much like to try to sink one of the battleships at least, needing just one more hit here on Haruna to do so, we have to keep in mind the gunnery target modifiers chart. And you will see under gunnery factors halved, the second line, any aircraft, light cruisers, and all escorts, which would include these destroyers, versus battleships, battleship carriers, and battle cruisers, their firepower factors are halved. So even if all 3 of them combined against Haruna, we'd have 1 + 1 + 2 for a grand total of 4 factors, from which we would have to subtract the protection factor of 6, putting us on the 1 to 2 column. And we would have to roll a 10 or better in order to achieve that hit. So instead, maybe the British will try to maybe at least sink something. And with that in mind, I think they're going to take on their counterparts here in the Japanese destroyer force. Not only will they have a lower protection factor to deal with and fewer hit points to actually sink the ship, but if we go back to the gunnery target modifiers chart, we can see here under the gunnery factors doubled, the same anti-aircraft light cruisers, destroyers, and destroyer escorts when shooting at escorts or other types are doubled, not halved, which means the Electra, if she were to engage any of the Japanese destroyers, would have 4 firepower factors. So what I think we will do is have Electra and Express concentrate their fire on the first Japanese destroyer here, Arashio. That's going to give us 4 + 4 for a total of 8. The S-class destroyer flotilla with a gunnery factor of 4 doubled to 8, firing at Asashio here. The second one will also put 8 gunnery factors on him. So the Japanese destroyers, there are 9 of them with 3 targets. That conveniently breaks down into 3 destroyers firing at each of the Royal Navy ships. And again, their factors will be doubled. So you would have 4 doubled to 8. So it'd be 8 + 8 + 8. That's 24. They all have 4 gunnery factors doubled. So it's going to be 24 factors coming back at each of the Royal Navy ships. So let's resolve the Royal Navy fire first. We have the 2 destroyers firing at Arashio, 8. We're going to subtract the protection rating of 3, which gives us a 5. We'll roll once on the 5 column, and the modifiers are going to be 0 for weather, +1 for the British NEM, 0 for radar. Interference, we have 2 ships firing, so that's going to be a -1. It's going to take us down to a net 0. There's no splitting of fire, and we're not in extended search mode. The target is not fuel depleted, and they're not. The target is not covering. So we have a straight up roll with no modifiers, and we'll go to the naval gunnery chart here. 1 die roll. It is a good die roll. It is an 8. An 8 on the 5 will achieve 1 hit on the Japanese destroyer. Japanese destroyer has a protection rating of 3, which means it has 2 hit points. So we will go ahead and mark the 1 hit there. And it will be the same exact shot. Well, actually it won't be, because with the S-class it's 8 factors again, -3 for the protection rating, puts us on the 5 to 6 column. However, we only have the +1 for the NEM. There's no interference or splitting fire because it's a single unit engaging another single unit. So this will actually be a +1 on the 5 to 6 column. And I roll not quite so good. A 3 + 1 becomes 4. That is an M asterisk, and you can see that is only a hit against landing barges, landing craft, or a protection rating 1. And the Japanese destroyer has a 3. So that turns out to be a miss. Now, coming back at the Royal Navy, we've got 3 ships firing at HMS Electra with 24 factors. She has a protection rating of 3. It's going to take 14 of those factors to get to the 11 column. So we've got 1 roll on the 11, and that leaves 10 remaining factors. Subtracting the protection rating again from that puts us on the 7 column. So 1 roll on the 11, 1 roll on the 7. The modifiers for this are going to be 0 for weather, +2 for the NEM. They do not have radar, and we're going to have -2 for interference because we have 3 ships firing. So 3 ships, -1 for each one past the first one. That's going to offset the +2. We're not in extended search mode. The target is not fuel depleted. However, the target is covering a disengagement. So that's going to give us a +2. So ultimately, we're looking at the red die will be the 11, the yellow die the 7, with a +2 on each of those rolls. That's going to give us a 10 and an 8. So the 11, that's 2 hits and a possible critical hit. And on the 7 and 8 is a 3rd hit. Now we'll roll the critical hit table. So we've got 3 hits so far, and a 1 is no effect. Now the protection rating is a 3, which you can see is 2 hit points. The 3 hits will be enough to destroy Electra. So since we've already resolved her fire, we can go ahead and remove her. Next up, we have the next 3 shooting at Express. This is going to be an exact repeat. So red will be the 11 and yellow the 7 column. Again with a +2 because they're covering. This is a 3, which becomes a 5. That's 1 hit. And then on the 7, a 10 becomes a 12, which is 2 hits. And again, that is enough to sink HMS Express. And then finally, we have the last 3 Japanese destroyers firing at the S-class flotilla. We have a 6 +2 gives us an 8, and a 7 for a 9. So an 8, that's 2 hits on the 11 column and a 3rd hit on the 7. So that is going to be the end of the gunnery portion of round 2, and with the destruction of the destroyer escort flotilla, that is also the end of the Royal Navy force. At this point, the combat is complete. We actually did not even get to see how the torpedo combat works because this was such a one-sided battle. However, there is an option in this particular scenario to increase the number of surface combat ships for the Royal Navy to make it a little bit more fair of a fight. It's also going to make it a much bigger fight. But I think what I'll do here is we'll wrap up this episode with the conclusion of this battle, and in the next episode we will go ahead and see what happens when we give the Royal Navy a little help. A couple of more cruisers, actually several more cruisers, and some more destroyers. And I believe with the increase in Royal Navy ships, we will actually have the Royal Navy survive long enough for someone to start putting torpedoes in the water, and we can see how the torpedo combat works. Hope you found this interesting and informative, and thanks for watching today. We'll see you next time.